a river the color of blood, frogs pouring out of every crack in the mud brick walls, darkness so complete that men do not rise from where they sit for 3 straight days. 10 plagues. 10 specific, escalating, devastating judgments, falling one after another on the most powerful empire on earth. And here is the question almost nobody asks. Why these 10? Not 8. Not 15. These 10, in this exact order, building toward one final night that would change the shape of redemptive history forever. Most people who know the Exodus story think of the plagues as a kind of divine special effects, real escalating disasters meant simply to wear Pharaoh down until he gives in. And there is some truth in that. But that reading misses something enormous. Because when you look closely at the text of Exodus chapters 7 through 12, and you compare it against what we know of ancient Egyptian religion, the actual gods Egypt worshipped, the specific powers each of those gods claimed to hold over the natural world, a completely different picture emerges. The 10 plagues are not a random escalation of suffering. They are a systematic, deliberate dismantling of Egypt's entire theological system, deity by deity, until the only one left standing is the God who sent Moses in the first place. This is not a footnote to the Exodus story. This is the Exodus story, told at the level the original audience would have understood it. The Israelite slaves who left Egypt did not grow up reading systematic theology. They grew up in a culture saturated with Egyptian religious imagery, sacred bulls, divine rivers, sun gods, frog-headed fertility goddesses. When God moved against Egypt, he was not throwing thunderbolts at random. He was answering, point by point, the specific claims of a specific pantheon. And by the time we reach the 10th plague, the contest is not even really about Pharaoh anymore. It is a direct confrontation between the living God of Israel and the gods of the most sophisticated civilization on earth, and a confrontation, the text makes unmistakably clear, between two seemingly equal powers that ends in total, structural victory for one side. We are going to walk through all 10 plagues in their biblical order. For each one, we are going to look at the text in Exodus, the Egyptian deity or system of belief it confronts, and what the plague specifically demonstrates. By the end, I think you will never read this story the same way again, and you will understand why the final plague had to be the final plague, and why nothing less would do. Let us start with the setup, because the setup matters enormously. Exodus chapter 7, verse 5, gives us God's own stated purpose before the plagues even begin. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, when I stretch out my hand on Egypt and bring out the children of Israel from among them. Notice the verb. No. This is not primarily about punishing Pharaoh, although judgment is certainly present. It is about establishing knowledge, a public, undeniable demonstration of who actually holds power over creation. And then, just a few verses later, in chapter 7 verse 17, God tells Moses to say to Pharaoh, "By this you shall know that I am the Lord." The plagues are an argument. They are a demonstration with a thesis statement, repeated again and again throughout the narrative. I am the Lord. Not the Nile. Not Ra. Not Happy. Not Hecate. I am the Lord, and there is no other. This matters because Egyptian religion was not a vague, generalized spirituality. It was an extraordinarily specific system in which nearly every feature of the natural world had a named, worship deity attached to it, and Pharaoh himself was considered a living god, the son of Ra, the guarantor of cosmic order, what the Egyptians called Ma'at. When the natural order of Egypt began to collapse, plague by plague, it was not simply inconvenient. It was a direct theological catastrophe, a public unraveling of the entire religious and political structure that Pharaoh's authority rested on. The first plague. The Nile turned to blood. Exodus chapter 7, verses 17 through 21. Moses, at God's command, strikes the water of the Nile with his staff in front of Pharaoh, and the river along with the streams, canals, ponds, and every container of water in the land turns to blood. The fish die. The river stinks. The Egyptians cannot drink from it. Here is what most people miss about this plague. The Nile was not merely a useful body of water to the Egyptians. It was the literal source of life for the entire civilization, and it was worshipped as such. The god Hapi was the deification of the Nile's annual flooding, the force believed to bring fertility and abundance to the land. Beyond Hapi specifically, the Nile itself was sometimes described in Egyptian religious texts as the bloodstream of Osiris, god of the afterlife and resurrection, its waters carrying divine life force through the land the way blood carries life through a body. Think about the precision of what happens here. The river that was worshipped as the source of life is turned, quite literally, into the substance the Egyptians associated with death. Osiris's bloodstream becomes an image not of life, but of mortality. The very first plague does not just damage Egyptian infrastructure. It directly assaults the theological claim that the Nile is divine and life-giving, by transforming it into something repulsive and lethal. And it lasts 7 days, according to Exodus 7 verse 25, 7 being the number that, throughout Scripture, marks something as complete. This is not a partial demonstration. It is total, for an entire week, before Pharaoh is given any reprieve. The second plague. Frogs. Exodus chapter 8, verses 1 through 15. Frogs emerge from the Nile, and its waters in such overwhelming numbers that they cover the land, climb into Egyptian houses, fill the ovens and kneading bowls, and make daily life essentially impossible. This plague targets Hecate, the Egyptian goddess of fertility, childbirth, and the renewal of life, who is depicted with the head of a frog. Frogs were sacred to Hecate specifically because of the explosive fertility of frogs during the Nile's annual flood season. Frog populations would boom dramatically after the floodwaters receded, and the Egyptians associated this with the goddess's blessing of abundant fertility on the land. Here is the irony the text is communicating, and it is a brutal one. What Hecate's worshippers associated with blessing and fertility, God turns into a curse and an infestation. The very symbol of divine fertility becomes a symbol of chaos, disgust, and unmanageable excess. It is the same animal, but it has been entirely repurposed, fertility's icon overflowing into something the Egyptians cannot escape, in their beds, in their kitchens, in their bread. And notice something significant in verse 8. This is the first plague where Pharaoh personally pleads with Moses for relief. Whatever Egyptian theology said about Hecate's protective fertility, it offered him absolutely nothing in the face of this judgment. The third plague. Lice or gnats, depending on the translation. Exodus chapter 8, verses 16 through 19. Aaron strikes the dust of the land, and it becomes lice or biting gnats throughout all of Egypt, on man and beast alike. This plague is significant for a different reason than the first two. It is the first plague the Egyptian magicians cannot replicate. Verse 18 tells us plainly, "Now the magicians so worked with their enchantments to bring forth lice, but they could not." Up to this point, Pharaoh's court magicians had been able to imitate, at least partially, what Moses and Aaron did. They had turned water to blood, and they had even brought forth frogs of their own. But here, for the first time, their power runs out completely. Some scholars connect this plague to the Egyptian god Gib, the god of the earth, since the lice or gnats come directly out of the ground itself. The very substrate that Gib supposedly governed becomes the source of torment rather than stability. Whether or not that specific connection holds for every reader, the larger theological point is unmistakable, and is stated by the magicians themselves in chapter 8, verse 19. This is the finger of God. Even Pharaoh's own religious professionals, men whose entire vocation was manipulating and channeling Egypt's spiritual powers, are forced to admit that something beyond their entire system is now at work. The fourth plague. Flies. Exodus chapter 8, verses 20 through 32. Swarms of flies fill Pharaoh's house, the houses of his servants, and all the land of Egypt, corrupting the land itself, according to verse 24. Several scholars connect this plague to Capri, the scarab beetle god associated with the rising sun, rebirth, and the ongoing renewal of life. The Egyptians saw the dung beetle pushing its ball of dung as the great cosmic image of the sun being pushed across the sky each day. Other scholars link the plague of flies to Watchet, a fly-associated deity, or to the general principle of insect-related fertility and protection gods. Whichever specific connection a given scholar emphasizes, the larger pattern again holds. An insect type associated in Egyptian religion with divine protection, renewal, or cosmic order becomes, in God's hands, an instrument of corruption and ruin. But there is something genuinely new in this fourth plague, and it is enormously significant for everything that follows. Verse 22. And on that day I will set apart the land of Goshen, in which my people dwell, that no swarms of flies shall be there. This is the first plague where God explicitly distinguishes between Egypt and Israel. Goshen, where the Hebrew slaves lived, is untouched, while the rest of Egypt suffers. From this point forward, every remaining plague will draw an increasingly sharp line between the people who belong to the Lord and the people who do not. This is no longer simply a contest about which God has power. It is a contest about which people belong to which God. If you are seeing how deliberately structured this narrative actually is, take a second and share this with someone who would find this fascinating. Subscribe if you have not already. We go several layers deeper into the historical and theological background than most teaching on the Exodus ever does. The fifth plague. Death of livestock. Exodus chapter 9, verses 1 through 7. A severe pestilence strikes all the livestock of Egypt, horses, donkeys, camels, herds, and flocks, while, again, the livestock belonging to the children of Israel remain completely unharmed. This plague strikes directly at several of Egypt's most prominent deities. Hathor, the goddess often depicted as a cow or with cow's horns, governed motherhood, fertility, and protection. Apis, the sacred bull of Memphis, was considered a living incarnation of divine power, and was treated with extraordinary reverence as a literal physical bull kept in a temple, worshipped as a god in flesh. Nevis, another sacred bull associated with the sun god Ra, held similar status in a different region of Egypt. Notice what is happening theologically. These were not abstract, distant deities. Apis in particular was a god you could walk up to and see a literal animal, alive, in a temple, receiving worship. And that animal's entire species, across the nation, falls dead in a single devastating event. If Apis truly held the divine power Egyptian religion attributed to him, his own kind should have been protected. Instead, the gods represented in cattle and livestock proved powerless to protect even their own physical incarnations. And once again, verse 4 specifies, "The Lord will make a difference between the livestock of Israel and the livestock of Egypt." The line between the two peoples grows sharper still. The sixth plague. Boils. Exodus chapter 9, verses 8 through 12. Moses and Aaron take handfuls of ashes from a furnace and throw them toward the sky, and the ashes become boils breaking out on man and beast throughout the land. This plague is widely connected to Sekhmet, the lioness-headed goddess associated with both healing and plague, or alternatively to Sunu, sometimes referenced in connection with pestilence, or to Isis, the great goddess of healing and magic, to whom the Egyptians prayed in times of illness. Whichever deity is emphasized, the principle is the same. Egypt's gods of healing and medicine gods the population would have turned to for relief from exactly this kind of physical affliction are shown utterly incapable of responding. And here is a detail that connects this plague directly back to the first one in a way that is easy to miss. The ashes are thrown up by Moses, the same Moses who, according to Exodus chapter 2, was drawn from the Nile as an infant and raised within Pharaoh's own household, educated, almost certainly, in some measure of Egyptian religious and court life. The man who once would have been trained to revere these very gods is now the human instrument through which their impotence is exposed. And verse 11 delivers one of the most pointed lines in the entire narrative. And the magicians could not stand before Moses because of the boils, for the boils were on the magicians and on all the Egyptians. Egypt's own religious professionals, the very men whose job was to manipulate divine power on Egypt's behalf, are themselves struck down by the affliction they cannot heal. The healers cannot even heal themselves. The seventh plague. Hail. Exodus chapter 9, verses 13 through 35. This is where the plagues escalate into a new register entirely. God tells Moses to warn Pharaoh in advance. Verse 18. Behold, tomorrow about this time, I will cause it to rain a very heavy hail, such as has not been in Egypt since the day it was founded. Fire mingles with the hail. It destroys crops, trees, and any man or animal left out in the open field. This plague confronts Nut, the sky goddess who, in Egyptian cosmology, formed the literal vault of heaven, arching her body over the earth to hold back chaos. It also confronts Set, god of storms and disorder. The very dome of the sky, the structure Egyptian religion credited with maintaining order between heaven and earth, becomes the source of catastrophic destruction. But notice what God does differently here, and it is theologically enormous. Verse 19 instructs Pharaoh to bring his livestock and everything in the field to shelter, because the hail is coming. God gives advance warning, with an explicit opportunity for any Egyptian who fears the word of the Lord to protect what is his. And verse 20 confirms that some Egyptians actually did this. He who feared the word of the Lord among the servants of Pharaoh made his servants and his livestock flee to the houses. This is a crucial detail. The plagues are not indiscriminate destruction poured out on an undifferentiated mass of people. They include, even within Egypt itself, a genuine offer of mercy to anyone who responds in fear and faith. Judgment and grace are operating in the very same plague, side by side. The eighth plague. Locusts. Exodus chapter 10, verses 1 through 20. A locust swarm so dense it covers the face of the whole land, consuming every plant the hail had left, every tree, until verse 15 tells us, there remained nothing green on the trees or on the plants of the field throughout all the land of Egypt. The locusts confront Sennacherib, a god specifically invoked for protection against insect destruction and agricultural ruin, as well as the broader Egyptian agricultural deities tied to the harvest and to Egypt's extraordinary fertility as a breadbasket of the ancient world. Egypt's wealth, stability, and reputation across the ancient Near East depended substantially on its agricultural abundance, made possible by the Nile's flooding. The locust plague does not merely damage crops. It strips away the very foundation of Egyptian economic and agricultural identity, the visible proof, in Egyptian eyes, of the god's blessing on the land. And here, for the first time, Pharaoh's own advisors break with him publicly. Chapter 10, verse 7. How long shall this man be a snare to us? Let the men go, that they may serve the Lord their God. Do you not know that Egypt is destroyed? Pharaoh's own servants, the men closest to his court and presumably the most invested in Egyptian religious tradition, recognize before Pharaoh does that the contest is already lost. The ninth plague. Darkness. Exodus chapter 10, verses 21 through 29. Thick darkness covers all the land of Egypt for 3 days. Verse 23 specifies that the darkness was so complete. They did not see one another, nor did anyone rise from his place for 3 days, while, once again, the children of Israel have light in their dwellings. This is the plague that strikes most directly at the heart of Egyptian theology, because it confronts Ra, the sun god, the most powerful and central deity in the entire Egyptian pantheon. Ra was not simply one god among many. The Egyptian state religion considered the pharaoh himself to be the son of Ra, a living embodiment of the sun god's authority on earth. Ra's daily journey across the sky was considered the fundamental engine of cosmic order, the thing that kept chaos at bay every single day. And for 3 days, Ra simply does not show up. Think about what that means inside the actual belief system being confronted. This is not a localized inconvenience. This is the complete, public failure of the most powerful, most central, most politically load-bearing deity in the entire Egyptian religious structure, the deity Pharaoh's own throne and divine legitimacy rested on. If Ra cannot even rise, what does that say about Ra's son sitting on the throne in Memphis? The plague of darkness is not simply the second-to-last item on a list. It is, after the final plague itself, arguably the most theologically devastating moment in the entire sequence, because it goes directly to the foundation of Pharaoh's own divine claim to rule. And now we arrive at the 10th plague. The death of the firstborn and everything that came before was building toward this single night. Exodus chapter 11 and chapter 12. God announces, through Moses, that at midnight he will pass through the land of Egypt, and every firstborn in the land of Egypt will die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sits on his throne, to the firstborn of the captive in the dungeon, to the firstborn of livestock. And this time, the distinction between Israel and Egypt is not merely geographic, as it was with the flies and the livestock and the darkness. It is something Israel must actively participate in to receive. Exodus chapter 12 gives the instructions in careful detail. Each household is to take a lamb without blemish, a male in its first year, and on the 10th day of the month wait 4 days, then on the 14th day at twilight kill it. The blood is to be struck on the 2 doorposts and on the lintel of the house with a bunch of hyssop, and the family is to remain inside the house through the night, eating the lamb roasted with fire, with unleavened bread and bitter herbs, dressed and ready to leave at a moment's notice. And verse 13 gives the promise attached to obedience. Now the blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and the plague shall not be on you to destroy you, when I strike the land of Egypt. This final plague confronts the entirety of Egyptian theology at once, but it does so through 2 specific and devastating points. First, it confronts Pharaoh's own firstborn son, the heir to the throne, the next presumed embodiment of Ra's authority on earth, the literal continuation of the divine kingship that the entire Egyptian religious political system was built around. Where the 9th plague struck at Ra symbolically by blotting out the sun, the 10th plague struck at the institution of divine kingship directly, in Pharaoh's own household, in the most personally devastating way imaginable. There is no recovery from this. There is no theological explanation Egyptian religion can offer that makes this anything other than total defeat. Second, and this is the detail that ties the entire sequence together into a single coherent argument, this plague also exposes that Egypt's entire religious system, for all its specificity and sophistication, had no actual power to protect what it claimed to govern: not the river, not the fertility of frogs and cattle, not the dust of the ground, not the healing gods, not the sky, not the harvest, not even the sun itself, and now, finally, not even the institution of the Pharaoh's own bloodline. Every single plague had already demonstrated the same truth in a different domain. The 10th plague simply demonstrates it at the place where it would hurt Pharaoh most personally, and where it would matter most politically: his own house, his own son, his own legitimacy to rule. But here is what I think is genuinely the most remarkable theological move in the entire 10 plague sequence, and it is easy to read past it because it happens so quickly in the text. The 10th plague is the only plague among all 10 where Israel is not simply spared because of who they are. In every previous plague, the flies, the livestock, the hail, the darkness, the distinction was geographic or ethnic. Israelites were untouched simply by virtue of being Israelite, dwelling in Goshen, owning Israelite livestock. But the 10th plague operates by an entirely different logic. Exodus chapter 12 makes unmistakably clear that the angel of death does not pass over a house, because an Israelite family lives there. It passes over a house because there is blood on the doorposts. An Israelite family without the blood applied would have faced the same judgment as the Egyptians. The protection is not tribal. It is substitutionary. A lamb dies in the place of the firstborn, and the blood of that substitute, displayed visibly, is what God says he will see and respond to. This is why the Apostle Paul, writing centuries later in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 7, calls Christ our Passover, who was sacrificed for us. This is why John the Baptist, according to John chapter 1, verse 29, looks at Jesus and says, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." The Passover lamb in Exodus 12 was never simply a clever ritual device to mark Israelite houses for skip-over. It was, from the very beginning, establishing a pattern, substitutionary blood, applied by faith, displayed visibly, that turns aside a judgment that would otherwise fall on every house without exception, Israelite and Egyptian alike. The 10th plague is not just the final defeat of Egyptian theology. It is the moment where God begins teaching his people, in the most vivid and costly terms possible, exactly how deliverance from judgment actually works. So let us step back and look at the whole sequence together. 10 plagues. The Nile, worshipped as life-giving, turned to the symbol of death. Hecate's frogs of fertility turned into plague and infestation. The dust of Geb's earth turned against the very magicians who claimed power over it. Kepri's flies of renewal turned to corruption, while God drew the first hard line between his people and Egypt. The cattle gods of Hathor and Apis and Nevis were exposed as powerless to protect even their own living, breathing incarnations. The healing gods Sekhmet and Isis were unable to heal their own priests. Nut's sky, supposedly the great barrier against chaos, becomes the very source of fiery devastation with mercy explicitly offered to anyone who fears the word of the Lord. The agricultural gods that underwrote Egypt's wealth and identity stripped bare down to the soil. Ra himself, the most powerful god in the entire Egyptian pantheon, the foundation of Pharaoh's own claim to divine kingship, failed to rise for 3 consecutive days. And finally, the death of the firstborn striking the institution of Pharaoh's divine lineage directly, while simultaneously establishing, in Israel's own houses, the pattern of substitutionary blood that the entire rest of Scripture will build upon. This is not 10 random disasters. This is a systematic theological argument, escalating in both severity and theological specificity, moving deliberately from the periphery of Egyptian religion a river, some frogs, some dust toward its absolute core, the sun god Ra, and the divine kingship of Pharaoh himself. And the argument's conclusion, stated explicitly and repeatedly throughout the narrative, is the same conclusion Pharaoh's own magicians were forced to draw with their lice they could not replicate. This is the finger of God. Not one God among many gods, contending on equal terms. The one God, before whom every claimed deity of the most powerful empire on earth proves to have no substance at all. So what does this mean for you right now? First, it means that the gods you are tempted to trust, whatever modern shape they take, whether it is financial security, reputation, control, comfort, or simply the assumption that the systems and structures you depend on will always hold, are not necessarily more reliable than Egypt's gods turned out to be. Egypt had a deity for nearly every category of human need: fertility, healing, agriculture, protection, cosmic order, kingship itself. Every single one of them, when actually tested, failed completely. The text is not simply ancient history. It is an enduring challenge to examine where you have quietly placed your confidence, and to ask whether that confidence is actually warranted. Second, notice the consistent presence of mercy inside the judgment. The warning before the hail. The chance for any Egyptian who feared the Lord to bring his household to safety. The repeated, explicit invitations to Pharaoh 9 separate times to simply let the people go and end the suffering. God's judgment on Egypt's gods was real and devastating, but it was never indiscriminate or capricious. There was always a door open, even within Egypt itself, for anyone willing to walk through it. Wherever you are right now, whatever judgment you fear you may deserve, the same pattern holds. The door has not been shut. And maybe the part that stays with me most is this. The 10th plague did not simply defeat Egypt's gods. It revealed, in the clearest possible terms, exactly how God deals with judgment that is genuinely deserved. Not by pretending it is not deserved. Not by exempting his own people simply because of their ancestry or their status. But by providing a substitute for a lamb without blemish, whose blood, displayed in faith, causes judgment to pass over the household it was always going to fall on otherwise. That is not a footnote buried in an obscure corner of the Old Testament law. That is the blueprint for the entire gospel, stated in advance, on the worst night Egypt ever knew, and on the night that became, for Israel, the first night of their freedom. The gods of Egypt did not survive contact with the living God, but the houses marked by the blood did. That is the whole story, told in advance, 14 centuries before a lamb without blemish walked toward a cross outside Jerusalem to do, once and for all, exactly what those Passover lambs in Goshen had only ever pointed toward. If walking through this systematically has opened up the Exodus story for you in a way it had not been opened before, help us reach someone else with this. Subscribe, leave a comment. Even a single word helps more people find this kind of study. Share it with someone who has only ever heard this story as a children's tale and never seen what is actually happening underneath it. Pray for us. God bless you.